the last 5 years, I've probably watched hundreds of hours of near-death experiences, and it probably began with me thinking about the idea of how would my children sustain their life should I die at some untimely and early age. And I wanted to get a better understanding about how to give them hope and optimism with such a grim topic. And so this is when I read a book called Die Wise from Stephen Jenkinson. And it's not a near-death experience book. It's not an optimistic book. The first half of the book is about his time that he spent in palliative care. And that's a very difficult area to be a practitioner. And then the second half of the book was a little bit more prolific because he talks about these incredible conversations he had with children who had terminal illnesses or adults. And I read that book twice and I felt an emptiness about it. And I was eager to pursue the topic more. And then I kind of fell into watching these near-death experience interviews. And they're, if nothing else, these are people who are so sincere, so authentic. Something extraordinary happened to them to the degree that they felt like they were given information and insight that could benefit the rest of us. And even to the extent that it might compromise their integrity or credibility, they feel compelled to share it. Maybe even just to tilt the world a few degrees in the right direction. And watching this, it's such a feel-good online piece of content. You can hear some sad stories, but they almost always have a happy ending in some way. And so I really appreciated that. And so I think that was my starting point for being interested in the topic.
And how did actually watching all this content, how did it help put things in perspective for you? Did your views around death change? And did your worry, I guess, that there might be a time where you won't be near your children, did that change in any way after watching this content?
Yeah, I guess my first big question was, does your consciousness persist after physical death? And that's a very rational and fair question for anyone to contemplate. And after I watched not just one NDE, but then 10, 20, I think that might be one of the biggest commonalities, obviously, is that their consciousness persisted. And so that gave me kind of a glimmer of hope of, well, maybe this is something I also can expect. And then as I started watching more of them, I started to find the pattern, kind of an aggregate pattern, the thread that threads between all of it. Because I feel like there's a more constant truth through the middle of these stories than maybe exists on the surface. And each video that I watched just compelled me to watch another one. And this is why channels like yours are so terrific, because that's exactly what you do, is you bring these people with incredible stories out for the rest of us to enjoy. And so I followed channels like yours and others a very long time, and that's how I consumed all of this content.
So you mentioned you started to see some patterns in NDEs. What are those patterns that you keep seeing?
Sure. So consciousness persists, number one. Number two, and this is in no particular order. Number two, it's very common for people to look at their body and feel indifferent about it. It's as irrelevant as a pile of jeans on the floor. Often there's a tunnel or light, so there's some transition from one space to another space. And then this is the one, an indescribable, overwhelming feeling of love, peace, relief. And often there's a life review, which is a really fascinating topic in and of itself. And it's essentially where a person gets to experience all the love and pain that they gave away to everyone that they interacted with in their life. And then people are either sent back against their will, or they're given a choice to come back. And there's also some kind of realization that they volunteered to come here to do this. And it was for growth, sometimes just experience itself. And generally most people feel a sense of duty or obligation to come back. And then the very last one, and this is interesting too, even if they chose to come back, people are disappointed when they get back. They're a bit devastated. Some people have long-term depression after it, Other people are more resilient, tales of resilience. More people are resilient and can bounce back from it. But I think all of them are permanently shifted in their perspective. And I would say that those are like the aggregate patterns that I see.
Mm. And is there anything that you feel we're not talking about when it comes to NDEs that's not being discussed as much?
I do, and I might not make a great deal of friends on either side of the camp. I'm kind of a pluralist to where I think that no one really has a monopoly on truth. And I'm surprised that religious institutions and scientific institutions don't express more interest in near-death experiences. And those two domains seem to be at war with one another. And that does bother me. I think both have an enormous amount of value to offer the world, but not while they're in opposition with one another. And I understand why they might not include near-death experiences openly. It probably violates some foundational parameters that keep their systems intact, and that is what it is. But if we could somehow find a way to pull a lot of this into one coherent view, civilization might be able to make more progress with NDEs at the center. I mean, it's such a prolific question. What happens to us when we die? And we literally have thousands of people coming back to tell us something happens. But I'll tell you something that I've thought about a lot. I've probably watched, I don't know, maybe close to 1,000 interviews. This is what I don't hear. People that come back and say, there's nothing. And I mean all of them. Like, it's not like 1,000 of these people experienced it and they all came back and said, nope, there's nothing. Because if that happened, Sabrina, I would have to rethink what my worldview was. And they don't come back and in aggregate all say that there's one person, one thing, one figure. They're impossibly specific to each person. And so what I think that people aren't talking enough about is this very topic that your show is central to. And you and I were talking earlier, this isn't a common topic. And it's sensitive and it's grim and people don't know what to think about it and it's complex and it makes it difficult. So we're all lucky to have shows like yours to be able to talk through this.
And yeah, we were talking about it earlier, and I think it's, as you said, it's such a missing piece in our conversation in general in society. We never talk about it, and to be honest, death is, even for me up until a year ago, it's something that I would have loved to not spend another minute talking about. It's not fun per se, but it feels like these conversations give a deeper meaning to almost everybody that watches, and that's a part of this community. So I often, to be honest, I think about what would the world look like, what would our society look like if this was a part of the narrative. We talk about politics every day, about who's winning the election, about what has happened. We talk about, football or soccer or Formula One. We talk about those things. You go to work and then there's this chat about what you've done in the weekend. There's never something as deep as why do you think we're here on earth, or what do you think is your soul's mission? And I play with this idea that if that would be a general topic of conversation, that the world would be maybe a little bit different. But I don't know how different, but it feels like it would be. Do you ever think of that? And do you think integrating it more in our society would change maybe how we go through the challenges that we go through?
Absolutely. In the book I referenced earlier, Die Wise, a large motif in that book is that North American culture hides death. So if there's an elderly person dying in a room, they don't want the kids to be in the room with them. And his notion is that you have to show people how to do it. You can't just talk about it. They have to be a part of that process. And not once, but incrementally throughout their life. I've often thought that death is such a polarizing topic because it takes a long time to metabolize, and people don't spend enough time metabolizing it, and then it emerges and it's right in front of them, and then they can't digest that idea. But I think that the earlier you can introduce it in the right ways, the more normalized it would be. Sebastian Unger wrote a book called The Comfort Crisis, which is a really cool book. And have you read it too?
Yeah.
There's a section in it where he talks about a culture that embraces death and that they don't hide it. And he talks about those people that having, I think there was a sociological study to where they were rated as being happier than other cultures. And there's something to be said about that. You know, we celebrate birth all the time. We celebrate weddings. To some degree, we should celebrate the end as well.
Yeah. And I think we should also celebrate the life that person has had. Because it's not necessarily an end if we understand it as such, but it's, you know, a moment in time that we're celebrating. Just like when you graduate, we're celebrating, you know, those years that you've spent in school training for something. So we're celebrating what you've achieved. Just like at the end of your life, we could be celebrating, you know, what your life has amounted to, instead of, I think, thinking of the lack and of the sadness.
Yeah, I do think that people will look at the absence and focus on that more than the presence that was there. But I'm a realist. There's a part of me that is trapped in the physical world with all of these emotions. And that part of me is going to experience this, and then there's the spiritual part of me that is going to be much more optimistic and happy that I got to be with that person, and that my intuition is they're in that overwhelming, indescribable love that is just repeated ad nauseum in every NDE I've ever read. And so I'm happy for them and I'm sad at the same time. And I do think that if we could perform some kind of alchemy to change that sadness into something that is better, it would be great for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And now you've mentioned, you know, what's out there is just a ton of love, and there's this, you know, great, what I've heard before is this amazing love that we've never felt over here. And you feel so accepted and loved and wonderful, and there's nothing ever wrong with you, which sounds amazing, to be fair. But there's always these naysayers that come back to those feelings, and they say, well, actually no, because you were tricked. Mm-hmm. And what you felt and what you've seen and what you've experienced is actually just a trick to, I don't know what, because they're never really clear why those people are being tricked. But because you've watched so many NDEs, what is your stance on this? Do you think there's anything out there to get us, to create an experience, to trick us into something?
Sure. Well, I don't think that science, again, has a monopoly on truth, and science's understanding of consciousness is elusive. They cannot pin it down. I mean, the scientific community will often even argue over the definition of consciousness itself. So I am very hesitant to listen to people who speak about this topic with any kind of certainty. Whether that they're trying to convince you that it didn't happen or they're trying to convince you that it did, I live somewhere in the middle ground. I'm trying to be as objective as I can. What I will say, though, is, you know, reading, so there's a book by Jeffrey Long, Evidence of the Afterlife. And what's cool about Jeffrey Long is he gathers data. Like, this isn't just him watching videos. He actually gathers data, survey data, and then he's able to aggregate it together and give you statistics about near-death experiences. And even within this book, and this is what I've seen in near-death experiences, is that people can have a physical death under the care of medical practitioners in a medical facility, and at that same exact time know what people are wearing and saying in different rooms. Now, I think that that is quite the metaphysical miracle, to have a physically dead body in a room and yet have your conscious awareness and ability to observe and interpret and recall with great clarity what is happening, you know, a block or two in a hospital down the hallway. We can't even do that with our waking conscious mind. How are we supposed to do that with a physically dead body. And so it's stories like that, and there's not one, there's many. There was a red shoe on a ledge in a hospital that no one knew was there. And a person had passed, and when they came back, they said, go up there and get the red shoe. And the practitioners were like, there's no red shoe. They went up there, there was indeed one on the ledge. There are individuals who were born blind, who had a near-death experience, who then recounted that they had sight in a way that they've never had before. This is really profound because, especially in some of these instances, there's no bias. It's so esoteric, it's so inexplicable that any one of these sequestered on their own are even too miraculous for my rational mind to sustain. But 10 of them, 500 of them, 5,000 of them, then you actually have something that could be a reliable data set. So those who say that your consciousness dies when your body dies, I really don't think there would be data to support that based on all the research that I've done. And just one little final period point on this. The scientific community will often look at near-death experiences and say it's subjective, therefore it's unreliable. We can't expose this to repeated experiments to prove it, therefore it's unreliable. We use user perception data all the time in our life to make accurate decisions on reality. Google reviews, Amazon reviews, TripAdvisor, Uber. And what's great about these data-driven platforms is you can go to a restaurant that has 4.7 stars, right? And there's 10,000 reviews. That's pretty reliable. You can even scroll down and see each individual comment that was left. And no comment is ever identical to another comment. But if you read through 100 or 1,000 of them, you can find the common thread throughout all of them. And if you search hard enough, you can certainly find the one-star reviews. And it's interesting to read the one-star reviews because you can tell, this person had to have been disgruntled to begin with. Like they already went in with some preconceived notions. To tether that, I also think that happens with NDEs with people who talk about hell. That's the one-star interview, of the 5-star experience. And it makes me wonder what they brought into that experience in order to receive that. Because I don't think that is at all in the aggregate. Hearing about hell and NDEs is the rarest thing that I've ever come across. It is there. I'm not going to say it's not. It is 1% or less that I've come across that have that. And even those have some kind of positive story at the end of it. They came away much better for it. So that's some of my feedback about your question on people who are materialists who think that the consciousness dies with the brain.
Yeah. Do you reckon when people have a hell-like experience in their NDE that it's maybe because of their upbringing or how they were brought up? Because that's usually my view on that. The people that I've talked to that have had an experience of hell or torture, they were usually raised very strictly Catholic. So by the time, they were 30 or 40, they would have this laundry list of sins and why they're such a bad person.
Sure. I would say this. They're shown what they need to see in order to keep growing. The reason why I say that is I've watched near-death experiences to where a devout atheist who truly believed that nothing existed was hit by a car, dragged underneath the car, pronounced dead on the scene, and was astonished that her consciousness persisted. And she had all of this logical scientific baggage prior to that moment, and it was disproven in that moment. That's interesting. I've watched NDEs where people are devout Catholics or Christians, and they're shown on the other side, no, that's really not the right system to follow. Man has kind of manipulated that. I've seen people who, again, are devout Christians or Catholics, and then they see the very thing that confirms what they've known all along. They see the religious figure that means most to them, and then that emboldens them down that path even more. So why people had the experiences, I think that the nuances matter less than we have to trust that is the way the other side felt they were going to learn most effectively so that they could continue to grow while they were here. The only thing that is close to a hellish experience would be the life review, and it's only temporary. And so if you've given away a lot of pain in your life, like in the aggregate of your life, 80% of your life was spent being mean to people, terrorizing people, physically hurting people, that's going to be a rough one, because you're going to have to chew on everything that you did. But it's not permanent. It is a curriculum of learning. And so that's the closest thing I think anyone is going to find to hell, is in proportion to the pain they gave away. Honestly, if you give a lot of pain, or if you give a lot of love away, you're going to get that too. There's an ROI on that. We have to think about this.
Yeah, for sure. It sort of brings me to think, at the beginning of my career, you know, I got this corporate job and I was trying to be really good at it, and I sort of thought, well, what does a really successful person do? You know, they get everything done. So I sort of try to morph myself into that kind of a person that gets anything done regardless, which made me not a very nice person to my coworkers and to other people that I had to work with, right? Because I had to get things done, and a lot of times it meant I had to get other people to get things done. And I think a few years in, I just realized it wasn't about the things that had to get done, but it was, I seemed to be most successful when I had a good relationship with people. So when I was nice to people and when people liked interacting with me, the thing would almost always get done in a pretty nice manner. But when I would just push and force my way into getting the thing done, the thing would just be stuck. So it almost, that really made me prioritize, instead of the work that needed to get done, but it made me think of the relationship that I'm building. And it made me think that I need to show up as somebody that people want to work with and that people want to do things for and with. So it completely changed my approach. And to be honest, it's been much easier. Because for me to be a control freak and authoritarian, it takes a lot of effort because I'm not naturally wired that way. So it also left me quite drained. But it was really interesting to come back to NDEs and discover that almost the point of it all is how we make other people feel and the love that we can send to the ones around us.
How wise you were to notice that. We have to, I think all of us need to be cautious about how much our free will collides with other people's free will. And if it's done in a high collision manner, there's a certain amount of chaos that comes at a cost of that. And if there's a certain amount of temperance that a person can exude in the world with their free will, the less collisions they're also going to receive along that path. And there's an old story where the sun and the north wind were arguing with each other about who could get the man to take off his jacket. And the north wind blew as hard as it could, and the harder it blew, the tighter he pulled. And the sun came out and shined, and the man willingly took off his jacket. And that's essentially what you experienced, and it is the only way to operate in professional environments. And I do work in a professional environment. I've always received better results when I'm trying to work with people and understand it instead of trying to drill them as some authoritarian.
Yeah. Now, I want to get into the model, and correct me if I get this wrong, the model of understanding that you've created of NDEs, which is just very technical, and I'm impressed at, I just want to say I don't want to say the science because it feels like an overall word, but I feel you've put a lot of, I'll just let you describe it. So you tell me what you've created and why you felt the need to do that.
Sure. So I'm not a scientist, and put that out there. I've created a 50-page hypothesis that I call unique coherence, a integrated model of consciousness. And the base model of this is the near-death experience research that I've been doing. What are they all saying? Underneath the surface, what is everyone saying? Because my curiosity is, well, how does this system work? Like, it is unfathomable when you hear people talk about these paradoxes to where it's like, well, I was a part of God and the singularity and the unified field, but somehow at the same time I was still an autonomous, independent entity, but I realized that everything was infinite, but that everything still mattered and wasn't deterministic. Like the choices I made affected God and everyone around me. Those are very paradoxical situations that people are failing to explain. And to a large extent, human language, we have constraints. Our concepts, our words, it's imperfect and imprecise. And so that can just make trying to study NDEs incredibly difficult itself. So what I did is I looked at NDEs and I loved them and I was fascinated by them. But I have this hyper-rational part of my brain that's like, it's still a little bit miraculous. You're gonna have to find something to anchor this to. And so that's when I went out and I was like, well, I need to understand chaos theory a little bit more as a layman and figure out, well, what is a fractal and what is fractal mathematics and what is the law of thermodynamics? What is quantum mechanics? What are quantum fluctuations? The Fibonacci sequence, that's interesting. Well, what is that? And so I just went down this yellow brick road of trying to look for scientific concepts that even sounded reminiscent of what I was hearing in NDEs. And I was trying to bring it into a coherent view. And so that was the outcome. Is this was about 6 months of me really researching and writing to try to put down on paper at least a first iteration of how it might work. And I'm probably going to have to continue to write this for the rest of my life. I don't know if there's an end to this.
It sounds like a beautiful piece of work to be creating for the span of your life.
We will see.
So walk me through this model. If I'm not mistaken, in the summary that you sent me, it starts with the Fibonacci sequence. Now, I know what that is. I still struggle to understand why that is the basis of everything.
Sure. And I've really tried to distill this idea in my head so that people don't fast forward through this or just stop listening. So that is the context I'm going to try to frame this through. When I think of a supreme being that has supreme rank over time, space, matter, energy, and perhaps its desire to share some level of truth with us, I think that it would encode it in nature around us. I think that a written document is vulnerable to distortion, that it could be destroyed, and that would not be a safe place to encode such critical information. And so that's when I started looking around nature, which we're a part of nature, right? We're all built from star stuff. And so that's when I started learning about fractals and about the Fibonacci sequence. And I'll talk about fractals first. So fractals can be seen in natural phenomenon. You can find them in snowflakes is the easiest example, though they exist in lightning strikes, tree lines, leaves, things like this. And the idea of a fractal is that it is a smaller copy of a larger copy. And a fractal can actually, it's a never-ending pattern. And that interested me, because it's like, so this very deeply philosophical thing surrounds all of us. It's like, yeah, you see it everywhere. No matter what level of magnification you zoom in or zoom out of, you're just finding smaller copies that all represent what the original copy was. And so conceptually, I was like, well, that sounds like consciousness. Like if there was an original conscious state that decided to proliferate its consciousness through reality, we would just be a fractal version of it. That's why we have enormous similarity between all of us. And yet, if we were to link it and trace it all the way back, it is to an origin. It's like, well, I like that idea. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment there. And then it's like the Fibonacci sequence. Well, it is this kind of design algorithm that you can find in leaves, river systems, an enormous amount of phenomenon in nature. And I'm not a mathematician. I'm very bad at math. I can do basic math in Excel, but it was the beginning integers that interested me. So what the Fibonacci sequence is it's a recursive sequence. Recursive meaning it uses itself to represent itself in the future. So it starts out at 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. And so how the math works is 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, and it continues on indefinitely. But when I looked at it, because a large question for me was, is God an emergent phenomenon, meaning it was nothing at some point and then it became something, or was it an eternal phenomenon? It's always been there. There was no inception point. And I looked at the Fibonacci for a while and it's like, 0 and then 1. That's binary. You see that in computer code all the time. Nothing to something. Like, that's really fascinating. It is also a part of nature like fractals are. It's like, all right, this is interesting, and I set those off to the side. And then I dwelled on that idea, and it melted my brain to the pavement. How does something come from nothing? And that's when I stumbled upon quantum mechanics, which led me to quantum fluctuations. And what is interesting about quantum fluctuations is that these particle and antiparticle pairs can emerge from nothing, exist for a brief moment, annihilate each other, and then return to nothing. And we see this all the time. And it's like, oh, well, it must not be absolute nothing. It might just be a nothing that we can't observe or measure at this time. But that is how something already occurs from nothing. So it is possible. And so those are the three ideas that I kept at the top of the hypothesis to try to describe, well, how does the system work? Is God eternal? And then what else does the Fibonacci sequence have to offer? And I'll pause here in a moment, but I think it also has to offer an interesting idea about free will and harmony as well. So I don't know if that adequately described it. That's the best I can do.
Yeah, I think you've done a much better job than I would have had you asked me what was your summary about, for sure. But one thing that I'm struggling to comprehend, and I think if I am, probably other people listening to this will be as well, is you've mentioned quantum mechanics and you've mentioned something appearing from nothing and us seeing this all the time and then disappearing. Struggle to understand. Can you give me an example? Can you break it down a bit further for me?
You know, to the extent that I've researched, that is the definition of quantum fluctuations, is that particle-antiparticle pairs emerge out of seemingly nothing. They exist for a brief moment. They annihilate each other and return to the vacuum. And just that concept alone is what I dwelled on. If that can actually occur somewhere in physics that is measurable and observable, and the Fibonacci can actually occur in nature that is observable, and fractals occur in nature which is observable, can this lead us down a more interesting route to think about, the chicken or the egg scenario?
So you've mentioned this model gives us an insight into harmony and into, was there always somebody, or was there always consciousness, or was there a beginning point? So what was your conclusion?
So we'll talk about perhaps the original conscious state as an emergent phenomenon. That's the terminology that I use. It's not correct or incorrect. Insert name here. When I view the Fibonacci of going 0 to 1, I imagine consciousness gradually occurring out of this unified field. I call it the eternal structure of existence. It is this quantum field where all possibilities are possible. And at some point, consciousness emerged. The original first manifestation of consciousness emerged. And over some period of time that I can't even conceive, 0 to 1 happened. Now, if you think about math, something doesn't just go from 0 to 1. You have an enormous amount of numbers after a decimal point. So I call it the subdecimal evolution. So from 0 to 1 could have been an inconceivable amount of time for consciousness to wake up and then to gain some sort of self-awareness and then to kind of build from there. Then you have, in the Fibonacci, you have 0, 1, then you have 1 to 1. Well, what does the second one represent? An affirmation phase. That's when it begins to understand that it has awoken, it has all of this incredible conception, but there's nothing else. And thinking of us as being a fractal consciousness, what emotion would you feel if you woke up in empty space and realized that you had all of this magnificent power and there was nothing else? It would be a strange thing. And so another subdecimal evolution happens that leads 1 to 2. And what my hypothesis states is that I think at some point the original conscious state realized it needed a relational framework. A system can't know itself. Donald Hoffman talks about this, who's a really great scientist on consciousness. He's been on a lot of very high-level podcasts. And he and Jordan Peterson agree that a system can't know itself. So what would it do? It would fractalize. It would create subversions of itself in an infinite space so it could experience itself from another vantage point, from another point of view. And this is akin to some things that I've heard in near-death experience. I've actually heard people use the word fractal. I've heard people use the word copy or representation or child, right? These are all the same concepts of these flourishing hierarchies. And so that's what told me it's likely that the original conscious state emerged from nothing. It existed for a long period of time. It had a period of its own growth. It realized nothing else existed, decided to create that relational framework, and then proliferated that throughout reality. And by doing so, merged back into the actual fabric of existence. And that is another fascinating idea, because that would mean that the original conscious state went from having some kind of identity to being a non-identity environmental force. And it was done through love. The 1 to 2 was done through love. Its original conception, I think that its brilliant epiphany was love. It wanted something to love and be loved by. And that's what it created. And that's why it's such a prevalent, pervasive feature throughout every NDE. It is literally woven into the fabric of our existence. I'll pause there, and then we could talk about just the idea of harmony and how the Fibonacci might give a description of that as well.
Before we do, does this mean that the fractals that this consciousness creates is actually us?
Yes. You are a fractal version of it, and I am a fractal version of it. And we all trace back to its original state, which means that we are all in an infinite state of expansion.
And it also makes, I think, us infinitely connected, not just to this consciousness, but to each other as well.
That's it. You hit the nail on the head. We are deeply connected, which is another trend that you hear in near-death experiences. We are all interconnected. You're exactly right.
So how do you, and this is something that I ask NDEs quite often, because I feel like most of the people, almost everybody to be honest, struggles with this. How do you then reconcile? I'm sure you've had, in your life, maybe people you didn't really get along with. Somebody that was almost just put on this earth to piss you off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do you then reconcile being connected to that person?
Sure. I would say this. If we were immersed in static state love and infinite knowledge, you don't go anywhere from there. There's nothing to learn. There's nothing to experience. So in this temporal space where we are temporary, we are meant to come here and grow. And the only way to do that is through free will. And that's what makes this such a difficult place to incarnate to, is from a lot of the literature that I've read, we generally have a plan, we generally have a strategy before we come here. And it's pretty good, and we've agreed to it. I think there's some fine print that NDEers might not be talking about, which is, oh, by the way, before you get there, just remember free will exists and everyone can go against the plan at any point in time, and there's not one of you, there's billions of you. Good luck, have fun. And then you get down here, and a lot of people aren't following their plan. They're not following, you might be following yours, they're not following theirs. And these collisions happen. But the beauty in these collisions is that that's what actually powers the engine of reality to keep moving forward. This is how growth happens. If anyone has any experience going to a gym, the only way the body is going to adapt is through duress. It's not going to grow if you just sit. You have to pick something heavy up. And then you have growth from it. It's the same thing. So that would be my explanation for why is there conflict. It really is cliche as it sounds. It's here for your growth. But the beauty of your free will is you can choose it to help grow you, or you can let it destroy you, and you're allowed to do either one.
What I found is you can subscribe to it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because there can be conflict around you, there can be circumstances and situations that are not nice, but you can always choose, and it's very difficult because people will say there's not a choice, but there is a choice if you let that get to you or not, and who you are and who you become in those situations. That's
true. There's a great quote that says, a person needs a stack of overwhelming evidence that they are who they say they are. And that's really profound. You have a bad situation with someone, but you handle it with grace and with respect. You walk away. That's a huge stack of evidence that you are who you actually say you are. And that's the road to mental peace, is that.
Yeah. And what I've also heard, I can't remember from whom, but it was almost like this view, and I have to say I've taken this view much more since I've uncovered NDEs, that it's almost like we're all being actors in a play, and we've all agreed beforehand, to play certain roles. So maybe somebody agreed before we came here to be the person that challenges me, to be the person that makes my life impossible so that I can grow and develop what I need to do. So when encountered with that person, of course, I will not like them. I will not understand why they're doing what they're doing to me. But if you look at it as, we're actors and we have to do this play where we've already agreed that you're going to do this and I'm going to do this and we're going to meet in that kind of a situation, then it almost becomes like a game. And then I think what was helpful for me in that frame was that I was able to detach from it. And I was almost able to think, well, who have I become in the process? And I think I would be lying if I said I would thank the person, because I do have a specific person in mind. But I would definitely appreciate that situation, the duress that I was under, has created skills and qualities in me that I probably wouldn't have had otherwise. So to me, it was a very beneficial frame, to be honest.
I like that as well. Alan Watts, I listened to him for a long time back in the day when I was running marathons. I would listen to him at night, and he often talked about the actor in the play. In my personal view, for me, I would make a small adjustment. I don't think that there's a static character. I think that there is a fluid concept of who we're supposed to be. And we changed that fluid concept. And the only reason why I mention that is I would hate for evil people to feel emboldened that they're evil for a good reason. you know, and that's not acceptable. I think that evil people who are out there, and that are people who are specifically interested in cruelty. These aren't people who are, you know, rude at a customer service checkout line. Like, we're talking about really malevolent people. They're very off path from their plan. They're spiraling, and that is not helpful to the rest of us. And I don't think that there's permanent punishment for this. There is a very difficult learning protocol that happens to them when they return back home. And they get kind of cleansed and rejuvenated, and then there's that time to reflect. And I'm sure that all of us at some point probably did have an evil or cruel lifetime. You know, with the idea of fractals permutating forever, reincarnation permutating, I have no doubt I was probably a barbarian in some prior life, and hopefully I learned some important lessons so that I could come into this life and have children and love them and treat them right. So all of us were barbarians at one point, but we should use our free will against the evil in the world. You can't just let it happen. You have to thrust your will against it so that you can keep tilting the world in a favorable direction.
So let's go to the harmony part of the model. How does that come into play?
Oh, okay. There is a concept within the Fibonacci sequence called the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is basically when all of these integers that are summing the two prior numbers together in order for that number to exist, and it keeps building, it actually hits a point where it almost hits a static state number. It's like 1.618033, and it goes forever. And I thought about the golden ratio because if you look at the golden ratio aesthetically, it is supposed to be perfect dimensions, like flawless dimensions. And if you actually look at an image of a golden ratio, like a human face with a golden ratio, it doesn't look right. It's so perfect that it's strange to look at. And what I started to take from that lesson when I ruminated on that is that here's this beautiful design that's built into the fabric of our nature, and there's this math that's communicating a message to us, and this math gets extremely close to being perfect, but it never does. And perhaps harmony is 1 or 2 degrees away from a perfect state. Maybe that's what propels reality forever, is what is being shared with us in the golden ratio. If it hit a perfect state, the numbers would stop. The music would stop. To me, that seems like annihilation. That seems like apocalypse, if something permanently stops. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't. It continues forever with just these slight variations. And so I thought to myself, that could help humanity maybe rethink what perfection is. There's an old book from back in the day written by Taylor Caldwell called Dialogues with the Devil. It's written back in the 70s, and it's in letter format. And so it's the Archangel Michael writing letters to Lucifer. And it's like, oh, brother, how are you? And they exchange these letters. And then as the book progresses, they become, incredibly divisive with one another. But at one point, the character of Lucifer basically says, you know that hell is a perfect place, right? He says, you understand that like everyone can play the violin perfectly. Everyone can kick a soccer ball perfectly. Everyone can paint the perfect portrait. There's no differentiation. The food is so good, there's no differentiation. You're all the same. That's why it's an awful place. None of you have your uniqueness to you. Mm-hmm. And so I thought about that, and it's like, man, this would help people look at themselves in the mirror. You don't need to be perfect of how you look. You don't need to be perfect in how you act. It's okay to make mistakes. It would alleviate all of this buried trauma that is in all of us about being perfect. And I wonder in a sense if that's where the concept of original sin came from, is you think of this eternal being that has its will, its higher order will, and then we have this lower order will. Eventually won't those collide and be in conflict? And it's like, no, they actually don't. They work in harmony. It's okay. everything is going to be okay, and you don't need to be perfect. In fact, your imperfections are the very thing that make you beautiful. Your imperfections are the very thing that makes the universe continue to expand. It's a beautiful way to think about it. So that's just my notion of trying to interpret odd math found in nature.
I agree. And I think it reminds me of this one point. I think I was in high school and I read this book. Would have been by Stendhal, but it talked about what happens in the mind of somebody who's in love, and he associated it with a tree, a little piece of a tree. That just, when winter comes, it just gets a bit icy. So the ice just sort of like crystallizes, and that's the brain of somebody who's in love, that they're exposed to this other person, and they build this image on top of that person of, what they love about them. So the person that you love almost becomes like unique to you, because you see their features like in a very unique and different way, together with your appreciation and with your emotions. So nobody else looks at that person the same way you do. And that to me was so beautiful. I've always remembered that.
That is very poetic. I love that.
But when you talked about imperfection, and you also mentioned Conversations with the Devil, I have to say one of my favorite books is Dr. Faustus by Goethe.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read it?
Mephistopheles was in it, making deals. Yes.
Yeah. And the thing is, I had to read it in high school, but it ended up being my favorite book, to be honest, and I think there's so much we can learn from it. And for everybody who hasn't read it yet, the short version of it is that you have this very educated man that just always feels that the more he learns, he realizes he knows less and less of everything that there is to know. So he just becomes very frustrated with how can he ever be able to understand the world and everything. And because he's just unhappy, this opportunity arises for him to get whatever would be possible for him to get. So the devil, or Mephisto, comes into play, and previously the book actually starts with a prologue in heaven, where Mephisto makes a deal with God that he can take Dr. Faustus away from his path. And that's why Mephisto comes into play. So he promises that he can give him whatever he wants. And what he wants is this understanding and all of the knowledge of the world. But when Dr. Faustus asks Mephisto who he is, he says, I'm a part of that force that constantly wants the bad or the evil, but always achieves the good. And my quote is very butchered because I know the quote in German, but you can look it up in English, and I think it's why contrast is so important and why challenges are so important. Because we see them as bad, we see them as evil, right? Something that shouldn't happen to us. But it's actually what achieves the greater good in the long term.
That was a great depiction of that story. And there's such an important question about why do we suffer? That's probably one of the most prevalent questions. Like, why would a benevolent, all-loving God allow all of this suffering to happen? This is often an atheistic approach to try to dismantle religion. There's a movie called Bottle Rocket about wine vineyards, and especially wine vineyards in California. And they were trying to compete with the French on making the best wine. And the problem was that their vineyard was in this arid part of California. There was no water. And so they barely got any water. And the roots would have to dig and dig to find water. And that straining root that was going into the water produced these grapes that made the best wine on the planet. That's just another analogy for what you were saying. He is a force of bad that essentially only achieves good. If people can really start to view adversity and struggle and difficulty as a virtue and not as an enemy, they could probably manifest a lot of strength and shift themselves to a different reality in their consciousness. And I do think that unfortunately a lot of people don't either think about it or don't have enough strength to turn it on its head. And it has made an enormous difference in my life. Anytime something really bad happens, I'm pretty grateful for it.
In that moment or in hindsight?
In that moment. A few weeks ago, I got really sick. It was probably something akin to COVID, but I was sick for about 5 days. I had 24-hour fevers. My body ached. I kind of put myself up in my room and didn't let the kids or my wife be around me. And honestly, I kind of loved it because it's like, this doesn't feel very good. I'm going to appreciate feeling good so much more when this passes. Like, I'm lucky to even be able to feel this because I can get up and walk around. There are people who can't even do that. Like, I'm lucky to have a body to begin with. I'll just watch some movies or read some books or sleep. Like, I'm not going to suffer, and that's the difference. Suffering is a choice. Pain is not. Like, you're going to feel that. That's just part of the thing that we signed up for. But I choose not to suffer. And I can tolerate a fair amount of pain. I think anyone can.
That's a very good lesson, and I don't think many people in your situation would have that frame of, being happy, because then it will make you appreciate feeling well. I think most people go into the why me, and why did this need to happen now, or God damn it, I had those plans over the weekend and now I'm sick, why? Instead of really appreciating it and seeing it as, okay, it's a few days of my life. But to me, and especially after seeing some people that were a bit older and it was clear that they weren't ever going to get better, but whenever I'm sick, I think, well, how amazing is it that I know that my body will bounce back after this? I cannot imagine being, 80-year-old and then thinking, well, maybe it's all downhill from here. Maybe it's not going to get better.
I've actually thought about that very thing in the throes of being sick. It's like, someday, Adam, you're going to get sick and you're not going to get any better. So pretend that was this moment. How would you feel? What would you think about? And I don't think about one thing. It's collapsing your entire life into a decimal point of just a notion. And in that, man, I feel pretty good. I was happy that I came here. And if this is it, it's going to be awesome. Like, I look forward to going back home. That's kind of what people refer to it. I'm not looking to take any shortcuts. I will run this thing as long as I need to run it. Throw whatever at me that you have to. Let's see how this test goes. But when it comes, I'm going to be kind of thrilled. Like, that's how much I believe in this stuff. So it's a win-win either way.
I absolutely agree. Now, Adam, we've, I think, covered a lot of ground, and I think your explanation are something that we probably need to listen to and watch a few times to really properly take it in. But what I want to end with is, what's the one message or the one thing that we haven't discussed that you think is important to share with everybody?
I would say that if I had one last kind of message to give, if you can withstand the harshness of life and still find love in your heart, then you've won the game.
I love that. I love that. Very beautiful. Now, tell me, if people want to get in touch, I know you, and you've mentioned it to me, that you're a private person. You don't have an Instagram or a channel that people can check out. But if anybody wants to get in touch, or they're interested in learning more about your model, or maybe they have suggestions or things to add to it, are you open to that conversation? And if so, how can they reach you?
Sure, you're right. I don't have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, any of that. researchneardeathexperience @gmail.com. You can email me there. I'm just a regular guy. I'll send you the model that I've written. I'm going to keep refining it. If you want to have a dialogue or have questions, I can make time for that. It's for free. Even if I enhance it, it's still for free. I just want to try to help people think about the world with some optimism, maybe through a different lens, and to talk about the subject that no one wants to talk about. And so thank you for bringing me on your show. It's your very show that is like a few others to where we're able to get this content. And without it, the world wouldn't tilt in the right direction. So thanks for creating this and building your following and having such open and genuine dialogue with people. You're making this place a lot better.
What I want to say is thank you so much for being open to this experience and for sharing what your understanding of NDEs and of the world is with us. Now, the disclaimer here is that, these were your thoughts. I've also shared some of my own thoughts. This is just how we view the world and what our thoughts were. So anybody is free to comment on this, but please just always be respectful. We'll add all of Adam's links, which is the email address down below.